In March 1983, at a moment when the Cold War appeared locked into a grim equilibrium of mutual vulnerability, the United States abruptly altered the psychological terrain of superpower competition with the announcement of the Strategic Defense Initiative, a sweeping research program unveiled by President Ronald Reagan that proposed the development of advanced defensive systems capable, in theory, of intercepting and destroying incoming nuclear missiles. An announcement that was less a declaration of imminent technological revolution than a calculated disruption of the assumptions that had governed nuclear stability since the early 1960s. The logic of deterrence during the mature Cold War rested on mutual assured destruction, a condition in which both superpowers accepted that neither could defend itself against a full-scale nuclear attack, and that this shared vulnerability imposed restraint by making the cost of war existential, a framework that had survived crises, arms races, and proxy conflicts precisely because it was psychologically internalized by political and military elites on both sides. The Strategic Defense Initiative challenged this framework not by immediately threatening to negate Soviet nuclear forces, but by calling into question the permanence of vulnerability itself, suggesting that the United States was prepared to invest vast resources in a future where defense, rather than retaliation, might shape the strategic balance. From its inception, SDI was framed in moral and defensive terms by its proponents, presented as an effort to render nuclear weapons obsolete and to protect civilian populations rather than to seek advantage. Yet within the strategic culture of the Soviet Union, the announcement was interpreted through a very different lens, one shaped by historical experience, institutional paranoia, and a deep sensitivity to shifts in technological competition. Soviet planners understood that even a partial or unreliable defensive system could undermine deterrence by introducing uncertainty, forcing an adversary to assume worst-case scenarios and to compensate through costly countermeasures. And it was this uncertainty, rather than the feasibility of space-based lasers or missile shields, that made SDI destabilizing. The timing of the initiative amplified its impact, coming amid renewed East-West tension following the collapse of détente, the deployment of intermediate-range missiles in Europe, and a broader climate of mistrust that had been intensified by rhetoric framing the Soviet Union as an existential adversary, a context in which even speculative programs were interpreted as indicators of long-term intent. Within the Soviet system, the announcement of SDI triggered alarm, not because analysts believed the United States was on the verge of deploying an impenetrable shield, but because it threatened to force the Soviet Union into a competition it could ill afford, one that shifted the arms race from the realm of quantity to that of technological innovation, where the structural weaknesses of the Soviet economy were most acute. Unlike previous arms competitions, which had emphasized the production of missiles, warheads, and delivery systems within established industrial frameworks, SDI implied a race in computing, sensors, materials science, and systems integration, fields where the Soviet Union lagged behind and where secrecy and central planning imposed additional constraints. The psychological effect of this shift was profound, as Soviet leadership confronted the prospect that maintaining strategic parity might require not incremental adjustments but systemic transformation, an outcome that threatened the coherence of existing military doctrine and the legitimacy of resource allocation within the planned economy. Debates within the Soviet military and political establishment reflected this anxiety, as some argued that SDI was a bluff designed to extract concessions or force overspending, while others warned that dismissing it risked strategic surprise, a dilemma that encapsulated the psychological trap of the initiative, forcing the Soviet Union to respond to a threat whose credibility could not be conclusively assessed. This uncertainty was compounded by the opacity of American research programs and by the deliberate ambiguity surrounding SDI's objectives, which allowed U.S. officials to emphasize its defensive intent publicly while preserving its deterrent value as a source of pressure in private negotiations. The initiative thus functioned as a form of strategic signaling, conveying not only technological ambition, but also political resolve, and suggesting that the United States was prepared to redefine the terms of competition rather than remain bound by inherited doctrines. For the Soviet leadership, this signal arrived at a moment of internal fragility, as economic stagnation, demographic pressures, and the costs of maintaining a global military posture were already straining the system, making the prospect of a new and uncertain arms competition particularly destabilizing. The psychological impact of SDI was reinforced by its asymmetry, as the United States could afford to pursue long-term research with uncertain outcomes, absorbing failure as part of innovation, while the Soviet system, oriented toward meeting planned targets and producing demonstrable results, struggled to accommodate speculative investment without immediate payoff. This asymmetry magnified the perceived threat, as Soviet planners calculated that even if SDI never achieved its most ambitious goals, the effort itself could tilt the balance by forcing disproportionate expenditure or by compelling doctrinal concessions. The initiative also disrupted arms control dynamics, as it challenged the underlying premise that offensive and defensive systems should be constrained together, raising fears in Moscow that existing treaties could be rendered obsolete by technological change, and that negotiated limits might no longer guarantee stability. These fears fed into a broader sense of strategic insecurity, reinforcing hardline arguments that the United States sought not coexistence but advantage, and that restraint would invite vulnerability in a world where technology, rather than numbers, defined power. Yet the destabilizing effect of SDI did not arise from consensus within the Soviet system, but from its capacity to exacerbate existing divisions and uncertainties, intensifying debates about reform, priorities, and the sustainability of confrontation, debates that would later intersect with broader efforts to restructure the Soviet state. In this sense, the Strategic Defense Initiative functioned less as a weapons program than as a psychological instrument, one that exploited the interplay between perception, uncertainty, and systemic weakness to alter the strategic calculus of a rival already under strain. The announcement of SDI thus marked a critical inflection point in the late Cold War, not because it immediately transformed the military balance, but because it unsettled the mental architecture of deterrence, forcing the Soviet Union to confront the possibility that the rules of the game were changing in ways it could neither control nor ignore, setting in motion pressures whose consequences would extend far beyond the realm of space-based defense concepts. In the months and years following the announcement of the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Soviet response revealed with increasing clarity that the program's most potent effect lay not in its engineering prospects, but in the strategic anxiety it generated within a system already burdened by contradiction, as Moscow's leadership grappled with how to interpret and counter a challenge that defied established categories of arms competition. Initial public reactions from the Soviet Union dismissed SDI as destabilizing fantasy, deriding it as a violation of existing arms, control agreements, and an unrealistic attempt to militarize space. Yet these denunciations masked a more serious internal assessment in which military planners and political leaders examined the implications of even partial success and confronted the uncomfortable reality that uncertainty itself could erode deterrence by forcing costly hedging strategies. Within the Soviet General Staff and defense research institutions, analyses focused not on the likelihood of an impenetrable shield, but on the cascading effects of American investment in advanced sensors, computing, and command and control systems. Recognizing that superiority in these domains could translate into advantages across the entire spectrum of military operations, from early warning to precision strike, thereby widening the technological gap between the superpowers. This recognition intensified long-standing concerns about the Soviet Union's capacity to compete in high-technology sectors where centralized planning, bureaucratic inertia, and restricted access to global innovation networks imposed structural disadvantages that could not be resolved through increased production quotas or marginal adjustments. The dilemma facing Soviet leaders was stark, as ignoring SDI risked strategic obsolescence, while attempting to match or counter it threatened to divert scarce resources from an economy already showing signs of exhaustion. A trade-off that exposed the limits of a system designed to mobilize for quantitative competition rather than sustained innovation. Debates within the Politburo reflected this tension, as competing factions advanced divergent interpretations of American intent, with some arguing that SDI was primarily a bargaining chip aimed at extracting concessions in arms negotiations, while others warned that underestimating its long-term impact could leave the Soviet Union vulnerable to a gradual erosion of deterrence through technological asymmetry. This lack of consensus compounded the psychological strain of the initiative as uncertainty at the top filtered down through the defense establishment, creating a climate in which planning assumptions were questioned and established. Doctrines appeared increasingly fragile. The strain was particularly acute because SDI challenged the core premise of Soviet strategic doctrine, which emphasized offensive capability and retaliation as the foundation of deterrence, leaving little conceptual room for defense-oriented competition that could be addressed symmetrically. Unlike previous arms races, where the Soviet Union could compensate for technological lag through numerical superiority, SDI suggested a domain in which quantity alone might not restore balance, forcing consideration of doctrinal innovation and systemic reform. The initiative also complicated the Soviet approach to arms control, as existing frameworks such as the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty had been predicated on limiting defenses to preserve mutual vulnerability, and the prospect of American withdrawal from these assumptions threatened to undermine decades of negotiated stability. Soviet diplomats intensified efforts to portray SDI as a destabilizing escalation, seeking to mobilize international opinion and to reinforce normative constraints on missile defense. Yet these efforts were undermined by the perception that technological momentum, once unleashed, could not be easily restrained by rhetoric or treaty alone. Within this context, SDI functioned as a catalyst for broader reassessment, forcing Soviet leaders to confront the sustainability of confrontation with a technologically dynamic adversary and to weigh the costs of continued competition against the risks of strategic adaptation. The psychological impact of this reassessment was magnified by generational change within the Soviet leadership, as the deaths of aging leaders and the emergence of younger figures brought renewed attention to systemic stagnation and the need for reform, themes that intersected with the strategic pressures introduced by SDI. While it would be simplistic to attribute subsequent Soviet reforms solely to the Strategic Defense Initiative, the program undeniably intensified existing doubts about the viability of maintaining parity through traditional means, reinforcing arguments that the Soviet Union faced a qualitative challenge it could not indefinitely defer. In this way, SDI did not coerce the Soviet Union through imminent threat, but through the persistent suggestion that the future of strategic competition favored systems and societies capable of sustained innovation, a suggestion that struck at the confidence of a leadership accustomed to measuring power in tangible outputs rather than adaptive capacity. As the Cold War continued, The initiative's psychological reverberations would increasingly shape Soviet perceptions of choice and constraint, influencing not only military planning but also broader discussions about economic reform, political openness, and the possibility of redefining relations with the West, illustrating how a program conceived in the language of defense could exert pressure far beyond the realm of weaponry itself. As the mid-1980s unfolded, the Strategic Defense Initiative began to intersect more directly with the internal transformation of the Soviet Union, not as a singular cause, but as a persistent external stressor that sharpened awareness of systemic limits and narrowed the perceived margin for error, particularly as new leadership confronted the cumulative weight of economic stagnation, technological lag, and strategic overextension. When Mikhail Gorbachev assumed power in 1985, he inherited not only an arms race defined by missiles and warheads, but a strategic environment in which the United States appeared willing to redefine the terms of competition through innovation rather than accumulation, a prospect that underscored the unsustainability of existing Soviet approaches and reinforced the urgency of reform. Gorbachev's early assessments reflected a recognition that the Soviet Union could not simply outproduce or outspend its rival in emerging technological domains, and that attempting to counter SDI symmetrically would exacerbate economic dysfunction without guaranteeing strategic stability, a conclusion that informed his willingness to engage in arms control discussions that challenged long-standing assumptions. Within this context, SDI functioned as a psychological accelerant, intensifying the sense that time was no longer neutral and that delay favored the side better positioned to innovate, an asymmetry that placed the Soviet system at a disadvantage regardless of the actual pace of American technological progress. This perception was reinforced by intelligence assessments that, while skeptical of SDI's near-term feasibility, emphasized the broader ecosystem of research and development it represented, highlighting the united state's capacity to mobilize universities, private industry, and military laboratories in a manner difficult to replicate under centralized planning. The resulting contrast between open-ended experimentation and rigid production targets sharpened internal debates about the relationship between political structure and technological performance, lending strategic urgency to discussions that might otherwise have remained abstract. In negotiations with the United States, Gorbachev repeatedly identified SDI as a central obstacle to arms reduction, arguing that offensive cuts were meaningless if defensive systems threatened to undermine deterrence. Yet these objections also revealed the deeper anxiety that the initiative symbolized a future in which Soviet strengths would no longer guarantee security. The linkage of SDI to arms control thus served a dual function, operating both as a diplomatic bargaining point and as an internal justification for pursuing de-escalation as a means of preserving stability under changing conditions. Despite public insistence that SDI be constrained or abandoned, Soviet negotiators also explored scenarios in which reduced confrontation could mitigate the initiative's impact by lowering overall threat perceptions and diminishing the rationale for expansive defensive systems, a logic that aligned with broader efforts to reframe relations with the West. Domestically, the psychological pressure exerted by SDI reinforced reformist arguments that the Soviet Union faced a choice between adaptation and decline, contributing to the political momentum behind policies aimed at restructuring the economy and increasing openness, even as resistance persisted among those who viewed accommodation as strategic capitulation. The initiative thus became embedded in a larger narrative of systemic challenge, symbolizing not merely an arms program, but a mode of competition that privileged flexibility, transparency, and innovation over control and secrecy. As this narrative gained traction, the traditional calculus of deterrence began to shift within Soviet thinking, with greater emphasis placed on reducing reliance on military confrontation as a foundation of security and on redefining national strength in terms that extended beyond hardware and numerical parity. While SDI itself did not deliver a decisive technological breakthrough during this period, its presence altered the psychological environment in which decisions were made, amplifying the perceived risks of inertia and narrowing the space for strategies based on endurance alone. In this sense, the initiative contributed to a reframing of choice, presenting Soviet leaders with a future in which the cost of maintaining the status quo appeared increasingly prohibitive, even if the precise contours of American capabilities remained uncertain. The destabilizing effect of SDI thus lay not in its technical specifics, but in its capacity to make uncertainty persistent and unavoidable, forcing a system accustomed to planning against known parameters to confront a horizon defined by open-ended change. As the Cold War moved toward its conclusion, this psychological disruption would prove more consequential than any weapon system, shaping the context in which arms reductions, political reforms, and a redefinition of superpower relations became conceivable, and illustrating how the strategic balance could be altered not by deploying new tools, but by challenging the assumptions that governed how power itself was understood. As the late 1980s approached, the Strategic Defense Initiative increasingly functioned as a background condition shaping Soviet decision-making rather than as an immediate negotiating item. Its influence diffused through the broader strategic environment as reforms unfolded and the Cold War's rigid structures began to loosen. Yet the psychological imprint of SDI remained evident in the way Soviet leaders evaluated risk, opportunity, and the sustainability of confrontation. By this stage, it was clear within Moscow that the United States did not need to achieve a fully operational missile defense system to derive strategic benefit from the initiative, as the mere prospect of technological acceleration had already imposed costs by forcing the Soviet Union to reconsider long-term planning assumptions and to confront the limits of its economic and institutional capacity. This realization reinforced the argument that stability could no longer be secured through symmetrical competition, and that attempting to counter every American initiative risked locking the Soviet system into a cycle of reactive expenditure that would exacerbate internal weaknesses rather than alleviate them. Within this context, arms control emerged not simply as a tool of mutual restraint, but as a means of regaining strategic predictability, reducing uncertainty, and containing the psychological disruption introduced by SDI, a perspective that informed Soviet willingness to pursue deep reductions in offensive nuclear forces despite lingering concerns about missile defense. The linkage between offensive reductions and defensive restraint remained a central theme in Soviet diplomacy, yet the emphasis increasingly shifted from preventing specific technological developments to managing their strategic consequences through broader political accommodation. This shift reflected an implicit acknowledgement that the Soviet Union could not dictate the trajectory of American research, and that attempting to do so would only heighten vulnerability by tying Soviet security to factors beyond its control. As a result, Soviet strategy evolved toward reducing reliance on deterrence through sheer capability and toward constructing a security environment in which the incentives for destabilizing innovation were diminished. The psychological logic underpinning this evolution was evident in internal assessments that framed SDI as a symptom of a deeper imbalance between open and closed systems, and that concluded that long-term security required not only arms control, but structural change within the Soviet state itself. While SDI did not directly cause these assessments, it sharpened their urgency by providing a concrete example of how technological dynamism could translate into strategic pressure, even in the absence of deployment. The cumulative effect of this pressure was to weaken the ideological confidence that had sustained confrontation, replacing it with a more tentative and pragmatic approach that prioritized survival over rivalry. As the Cold War drew toward its end, the Strategic Defense Initiative thus receded from prominence as a specific program while retaining significance as a catalyst that had altered the mental framework of competition, demonstrating that the balance of power could be influenced by expectations about the future as much as by present capabilities. The Soviet Union's subsequent acceptance of sweeping arms reductions and its willingness to redefine relations with the West cannot be reduced to any single factor, yet the psychological destabilization introduced by SDI formed part of the context in which these choices became intelligible, reinforcing the perception that the costs of maintaining an adversarial posture were rising faster than its benefits. In this sense, SDI exemplified a form of strategic pressure that operated through anticipation rather than action, shaping behavior by projecting a future that appeared increasingly unfavorable to a system constrained by rigidity and resource scarcity. The initiative's enduring significance lies therefore not in what it built, but in what it suggested, namely that the competition was shifting to domains where adaptability, innovation, and openness mattered more than numerical parity, a suggestion that undermined the confidence of a rival whose strengths lay elsewhere. As the Cold War ended, the Strategic Defense Initiative stood as a reminder that psychological disruption could be as decisive as material force, and that in an era defined by deterrence, the most destabilizing move might be one that challenged the permanence of vulnerability itself, altering the strategic imagination of an adversary and accelerating a transformation already underway. As the Cold War reached its final moment, the Strategic Defense Initiative's most consequential legacy lay in how it reframed the meaning of power and security at a time when the Soviet system was already approaching the limits of endurance, demonstrating that destabilization need not arise from immediate military imbalance, but from the sustained erosion of confidence in the future viability of existing strategies. By the late 1980s, Soviet leaders increasingly understood that even if SDI never materialized as a fully operational shield, the initiative had succeeded in altering the strategic environment by forcing consideration of a future in which technological momentum, rather than negotiated stability, would determine outcomes, a future for which the Soviet Union was poorly prepared. This realization intensified the logic behind disengagement from open-ended rivalry, as the costs of remaining locked into adversarial postures appeared increasingly disproportionate to any attainable benefit, particularly when internal reform demanded resources, political capital, and strategic focus. The initiative thus functioned as a persistent reminder that the United States possessed not only material advantages, but a systemic capacity to absorb uncertainty, to experiment, and to redefine competition in ways that were difficult to counter through centralized control, an asymmetry that undermined the traditional Soviet confidence in parity achieved through planning and accumulation. Within this context, the erosion of ideological certainty accelerated, as the assumption that the Cold War could be managed indefinitely through deterrence gave way to a recognition that structural imbalance made prolonged confrontation unsustainable. The psychological effect of SDI was therefore cumulative rather than immediate, shaping perceptions over time and reinforcing conclusions drawn from economic data, technological assessments, and social pressures, all of which pointed toward the necessity of reducing confrontation, rather than attempting to outlast it. As negotiations produced unprecedented reductions in nuclear arsenals and political relations transformed rapidly, The Strategic Defense Initiative receded into the background as an active program. Yet its influence persisted as part of the mental environment in which these changes occurred, illustrating how strategic initiatives can achieve impact through perception even when their technical ambitions remain unrealized. In the final accounting, SDI did not end the Cold War by building lasers in space, but by unsettling the assumptions that had sustained it, exploiting uncertainty, asymmetry, and the fear of future disadvantage to amplify pressures already present within the Soviet system. The initiative's significance lies in its demonstration that in a mature nuclear rivalry, psychological disruption could be more destabilizing than immediate force, and that the projection of a radically different future could compel adaptation or retreat without the need for deployment. As such, the Strategic Defense Initiative stands as a case study in how power can be exercised through the manipulation of expectations rather than the application of weapons, revealing that the Cold War's decisive battles were sometimes fought not in arsenals or on battlefields, but in the strategic imagination of adversaries confronting a future they could no longer confidently manage. In its final historical balance, the Strategic Defense Initiative occupies a distinct place in Cold War history, not as a failed weapon system or a technological fantasy, but as a deliberate psychological intervention into a strategic equilibrium that had relied on the permanence of mutual vulnerability, and by challenging that permanence, SDI altered the mental framework within which the Soviet Union assessed its options at a moment of deep systemic strain. The initiative did not need to succeed technically to succeed strategically, because its true effect lay in forcing the Soviet leadership to confront uncertainty about the future shape of power, a future in which innovation, flexibility, and long-term investment appeared to favor an adversary operating within an open, adaptive system. This confrontation undermined the Soviet confidence that deterrence based on parity could be sustained indefinitely, particularly when achieving that parity required ever greater sacrifices from an economy and political structure already struggling to meet internal demands. SDI thus functioned as a catalyst that magnified existing pressures rather than creating new ones, sharpening awareness of structural weaknesses and accelerating debates about reform, retrenchment, and the viability of continued confrontation. Unlike earlier phases of the arms race, which could be measured in numbers of missiles or warheads, the competition implied by SDI was abstract, open-ended, and resistant to clear benchmarks, making it psychologically corrosive for a system dependent on plan targets, predictability, and demonstrable outputs. The destabilization it produced was therefore subtle but persistent, operating through anticipation and doubt rather than through immediate threat, and compelling Soviet leaders to consider not only what the United States could do, but what it might do in a future shaped by technological momentum beyond Soviet control. As the Cold War ended, SDI receded as a policy priority, yet its strategic significance endured as an illustration of how power could be exercised indirectly, by redefining the terms of competition rather than winning within them. The collapse of the Soviet system cannot be attributed to any single initiative, but the Strategic Defense Initiative contributed to an environment in which the costs of rivalry became increasingly clear and the benefits increasingly uncertain, reinforcing the logic of de-escalation and accommodation. Historically, SDI demonstrates that in a nuclear age defined by deterrence, the most destabilizing move may be one that questions the assumptions underpinning stability itself, introducing uncertainty where certainty had enforced restraint. In this sense, the initiative exemplifies a broader truth about the late Cold War, that its decisive shifts were driven less by dramatic military breakthroughs than by cumulative psychological pressure, acting on systems already under strain. The Strategic Defense Initiative therefore should be understood not as a story of lasers and space weapons, but as a case study in strategic psychology, revealing how the projection of a different future can alter behavior in the present, and how the Cold War's end was shaped as much by changes in perception and expectation as by material force.